Well, I'd like to just start by asking, what has it been like to be the CEO of a company that delivers endpoint resilience during a pandemic?
Uh, I think it's been well. I mean, I could throw in a whole bunch of adjectives. I would say challenging and incredibly rewarding. I think that when the world starts to change around you, right, our mantra has always started with how can we help, and so whether it is the pandemic or some of the other things that are going on in the world right now, I think that our first question we always ask ourselves is what do we need to do to help our customers? What do we need to do to help our employees? And so being in cybersecurity right in the middle of, when we have massive tectonic shifts going on in the world around us for a whole host of different reasons, it can make it a challenge. And especially, we were affected by the pandemic as well as serving customers who were affected by the pandemic. So like everybody else, we had to go to a pure remote working world. So it's been a very challenging couple of years, but a very rewarding couple of years for the company as a whole, as well as just me personally.
Yeah, it's at times like this that we really need to demonstrate resilience, and I think it's really when a company's culture can shine. So,
yeah.
Now listen, from a personal point of view, and thinking about your own leadership journey and your career. I know that you spent part of your career in Silicon Valley, which not everybody in BC's tech sector has. What did you learn from your time there that served you well in your roles?
So it's really interesting. I almost have only exclusively worked in Silicon Valley, right? So I was working for Sun Microsystems in Toronto. I was still very young. I moved to Silicon Valley 25 years ago. So yeah, I've been out a while. And actually, Absolute was my first opportunity to come back and work with a Canadian company for in a couple of decades. And so that was very, very exciting. I think that, the number one theme, and maybe this is just a theme that I've carried through so many things, not just in our products, but also in just personal life, is again, resilience. You hear it said over and over again, which is, Silicon Valley is about experimenting. It's about innovating. Yes, you will fail, and you will fail quickly, hopefully, but sometimes it's not so quick. But it's about what you do in those moments and how you kind of get yourself ready for the next sprint. And I think that while it's something that we all talk about and we all learn it in some way, I think that, that is a community that really just sort of thrives on that. It really, it is part of the growth experience. It's part of your day-to-day life. It is not an unusual experience. And so that's a very healthy attitude that I think you kind of take into the other parts of your life. And especially as a leader, right? You want to be able to take risks and, shoot for the moon. And failure is not your preferred outcome, but you're going to stub your toe in a couple of times along the way, and that's okay. That's healthy. And so how do you pick up and move on?
Yeah, I think that's incredibly great advice. Someone said in an earlier one of these sessions, if you can reframe from I win or I lose to I win or I learn,
yeah,
your life will become a lot more rewarding. so that's what I try to take from our tech world of experimentation, but not everything would be. Right? Now this roundtable is really about scaling up. And it's a challenge that a lot of our audience are facing. So we've got successful startups, they've got successful growth companies, but they really want to take it to the next level. You've been tremendously successful operating in companies that are already working at scale and building companies to scale. So I'm really interested to hear about your approach to scaling a company and how do you do that to meet
sure.
the opportunity?
I mean, so just I guess a little bit about my background. I have been in some very large companies, Apple and Motorola and Citigroup. I also, have run startups and advised startups, and then I ran the ecosystem teams for Palm and Apple and Motorola and worked with a lot of startups. And so I think the word scale is a little bit tricky because it makes you think that it's linear. It sounds so smooth, right? Like you're just going to go on this nice, it's going to be this nice up and to the right line. And that's never really what it looks like. I tend to think of these journeys more in sprints. You're going to, it's a sprint to your first round of funding, and it's a sprint to shipping your first product. And then it's a sprint to get to those critical revenue milestones, whether it's, 5 million in ARR, 10 million in ARR, 60, 100, a half a billion. And so each one of those is a very different journey. And I think that understanding that, the book is made up of chapters and that each chapter is going to have a very distinct, it's going to need different people in some cases, it's going to need different tools, it's going to need different partners. And so that tends to be kind of my view in terms of the word scale. If you're too hard on yourself and you think, it's supposed to be this nice 10% year over year or 20 or 30. And, I've taken a step back. No, it's going to look like a scallop function. And sometimes it's going to plateau and it might even dip. And then that's just getting you ready to build the energy to kind of go for the next shot.
What do you, I'm thinking more about your working with startups and helping them see their path. What do you think people struggle with the most? What's the most challenging sprint transition when you think about those series?
From a leadership perspective, I think it really is about building those milestones and taking the journey one step at a time. I think that many entrepreneurs, I don't want to generalize, many entrepreneurs and many leaders, you're shooting for the moon. And so you want it all and you want it right now. And I see this, by the way, is particularly true when you have leaders who've gone into smaller organizations who have been in larger organizations. So, folks who have been in a senior role and then thought, oh, this startup thing seems quite easy. It's fewer people. So how hard could it be? And it's about what you say no to, right? It's about how do you set up what those milestones are and then what is acceptable within each one of those milestones. When I was in my smallest company, I used to have a rule, which I was only allowed to say 1 out of every 5 things in my mind. I was only allowed to say 1 in 5 out loud, because I had come from like Apple and Motorola, where I had large teams of people. And so, we were constantly trying to move faster. When you're in a smaller world, right, every time you say something, it's going to be a distraction or a new project or, sort of slow down the work. And so it's really about narrowing and focusing on that chapter. Understanding the other chapters will come after it. It doesn't all have to be happening at the same time.
That's great advice. I'm taking that advice personally. My small team on the call is like, yes, make her only say 1 in 5.
My team was probably saying, maybe we should shoot for 1 in 10, Christy. Let's go for 1 in 10.
Exactly. So obviously that leadership journey, it takes you through lots of different stages. There's lots of learning along the way. One question I want to ask you about is when we think about women in leadership roles, we've had some other great women role models on earlier versions of this. And something that came up in those conversations is that there can be some very different expectations of women leaders. What are your thoughts on that? How have you navigated that?
As much progress as we think we've made, I think the stats it's still less than 4% of the publicly traded companies in TSX or in Canada right now are actually run by women. And so there are, we're not as far as we'd like to think we are. And I think we actually have just suffered a huge setback. I think early in the pandemic, there was research that was published that said, 1 in 4 women in the workforce off-ramped to help with homeschooling and taking care of kids. And because when the world stopped and we all had to go home, women bore a lot of the weight of kind of keeping the house together and moving things forward. And so the data shows that was, higher. It was like closer to 1 in 5 men who kind of took a similar role. So what that's going to mean for us is that we've kind of thinned the pipeline even more. And that's concerning, right? I think what we're all shooting for is how do we invest in young leaders, in folks as they're coming up through the workforce? How are we growing the population? And not just women, but I would say, broadly, when I think across all of the different voices that need to be around the table from a diversity perspective, we're just not there, right? And I'm tired of the excuse, well, I couldn't put somebody in that role because, I couldn't find a candidate, that had that level of experience. There is no trade-off required, right? This is not magic. You invest in the pipeline, and when you're filling roles, you take the time. You build into your timing and your plan that you are going to kind of make the extra effort to go broader so that you can get a broad slate of voices to listen to. So that's going to be a little bit harder. And I think that I'm a mom of 4 kids, so I get it. I get that when, homeschooling was happening, it became a challenge in every house. Now, I was very fortunate. My husband is stayed home for a couple of years now. But a lot of families weren't. You had 2 people working in the same house and they had kids that were homeschooling. So we're going to have to work a little harder to kind of get that engine going again and getting everybody kind of back and re-engaged, those that want to come back and be investing and kind of build that population out again.
Yeah, I think that's so important, that if we want to deliver the outcomes, we have to invest the time upstream on building the pipeline and the processes and the outreach tools that will increase the diversity outcomes over time. But we can't just have excuses, right? We really need to be doing active measures. So that's fantastic. Now, before we move to some audience questions, I do want to ask you about your perspective on BC's tech sector. We're really proud of having lots of great, thriving companies, but we're not satisfied with our level of success today. We think we could do more. When you look at the situation in BC, what would you say are some of our biggest challenges here in BC?
I'm going to say talent, but let me explain what I mean by that. I mean, I think it is the entire tech sector in every industry, and I still sit on public boards in the US and I work with companies in a bunch of different areas. Everybody is struggling to get talent right now. Everybody is struggling to find. A lot of people stepped out, not just kind of took a pause, but a lot of people stepped out or made big career or life changes. And so there's a bit of a reset that's happening right now. And I also think in the tech sector specifically, and this is maybe unique to startups, because when you and I have talked before, tech can be tech in a non-tech company, and it can also be, building a tech company. And both of those are rewarding journeys. I think that, in the building a tech company piece, we have a lot of, there's a lot of talent here, but we have to work harder to see companies get further, get more senior. When you get to a certain level, right, it starts to get harder and harder and harder to kind of fill those roles locally because there's not, I mean, if I look at our business, right, there's not a lot of, 200 million a year US sort of cybersecurity companies sitting around. And so you get creative, you start thinking about how do you map skills and how do you do other things, or I come back to building the talent pipeline, right? Why are we making the investments today that we can kind of grow more broadly? So I think that we have to continue the investment, and I'm a big fan of a lot of the work that you do on both of those tech profiles. But I'm particularly passionate about Canadian companies because I think that we are growing a lot of great tech talent that does serve organizations that are not necessarily Canadian companies, and that's fine, that's great. But I would also love to see a lot more sort of Canadian anchor companies going out and making a big impact on the world. And so we're just going to have to keep making that investment and building out that pipeline. It always comes back to people, no matter where you're sitting.
It's an exciting time actually in the spring of 2022 in BC. I had a great conversation just yesterday with government and realizing that at the BC government level, there is understanding that it is the tech and innovation and advanced manufacturing sectors that are going to create economic growth and job growth over the next decade. And so we're starting to really collaborate on how can we make sure that talent supply is keeping up with the talent demand. So I'm hopeful that we'll have some good things to announce later in the year. So that's our challenge, sure. Do you see any particular opportunities for British Columbia? Is there anything that we don't celebrate that perhaps we should? That's a real competitive advantage.
There's a ton. I mean, again, I'm going to go back to people. I do think that, one part about Silicon Valley is it is a little bit of a bubble, right? And so a lot of people have shared experiences. And so in the same way that I said a moment ago, that can be a challenge, in one of a previous US company, if I would say, hey, how do we solve this problem with ARR? And I had 6 people in a room, I'd probably hear voices like, well, at Google, we did it this way. And at Apple, we did it that way. And and so there's sharing best practices between tech companies. And when we have conversations like that here, there's a lot more diversity of experience because we have people coming from a lot of different backgrounds. They may be coming from gaming companies or forestry companies or mining companies or banking or healthcare or a whole bunch of other places, because tech, as I said, can be tech companies. It can also be tech in other companies. And so I think that that can be a strength. I think that sometimes, it's definitely in the last 3 years caused me to look at things differently, where you realize, oh, I guess it is a little bit of an echo chamber, a little bit of a bubble. I keep hearing the same thing over and over again. And so that diversity of thought, I think, is one of our strengths, right? I don't think you ever want to aspire to have everybody having the exact same background from any angle.
That's great. Andrew Reed of Rival, who's a longtime board member of BC Tech, used to say, 20, 25 years ago, when we were building the tech sector, nobody had tech experience. So we had to attract talent in from other industries, and we can do that today as well. So it's a great open-minded approach. And I agree with you that diversity of experience, diversity in all forms tends to deliver better outcomes. Now, okay, now I'm going to ask you a bit of a funny question for the two of us, because we've joked sometimes that people say Canada should aspire to being the Silicon Valley of the North. So what do you think about that? Is that the right ambition, or should we have something else?
Look, I don't think so. And I've been to all of them. I've been to Silicon Valley, Silicon Roundabout in London. I've been to Silicon Alley in New York. There's Silicon, I've been to, by the way, I've been to Silicon Sauna in Finland. Like, there is Silicon, every country you go to, they have their aspiration to recreate. And I just don't think you have to, right? I mean, Silicon Valley is great and it is amazing. And there's all sorts of things that we can celebrate about it. But I don't think, I think that we have a lot to celebrate about the tech talent and the culture that we have here. I would say that, what we have here, there's a tremendous amount of innovation applied to a whole host of different areas. And there's a different, I'd say, outlook on life, that you're going to find in British Columbia that you don't necessarily find in some of the other Silicon Valley analogies. And so I don't think this is about trying to homogenize tech and try to make everything look like Silicon Valley. I mean, I think WeWork is great, and if you're going to give out snacks and have a keg in the break room, that's amazing. But that's not to become more like Silicon Valley. That's not. That's just whatever makes sense to your employees at that moment in time. And there are some things, I think, when you try to homogenize that, it also, there are some things that are very unique to Silicon Valley, the proximity of capital to innovation, to entrepreneurs. There are some things that are going to be very, very difficult to replicate. And I think there's more than one way to solve that problem. Like the C100 is a great example of folks that try to match, capital to talent and support entrepreneurs in a different way. And it doesn't necessarily mean that we're trying to replicate exactly the same way that it happens there, right? We can solve some of the same problems, but in a way that is unique to us. So I don't think we necessarily need to take a page from somebody else's book.
I like it. I see Marcel in the chat is saying, "How about wine in the break room? Let's get rid of this."
That's in the fridge by my office, Marcel. I'll show you where that
is. So I do want to come back at the later, but let's stay on this talent theme because there's some good questions in the chat on that. But I don't want to leave this conversation without asking you about Absolute and your ambitions for the company and going forward. So we'll come back to that in a moment. But Miriam is asking, do you rely more on full-time employees to move your company forward, or do you work with a lot of consultants and freelancers?
I'd say all of the above. We are majority, clearly the bulk of it is full-time employees or badged employees. They may not be full-time. But, I'd say we have a very broad view on where to get help. We bring in consultants and freelancers and contractors all the time. I'm a huge proponent of remote work. When I first came into Absolute, I remember and Marcel will remember this as well. I said, we're a cameras on culture, because I was half in California, half in Canada, and I was traveling all the time. And we all remember that experience of being the one person remote when everybody else was in the meeting room. And so we said, even if it means we're going to duct tape iPads onto the walls, we're going to become a cameras on culture and sort of video conference. And so we started very early. It helped us as we had to move into the pandemic and everybody moved remote. But I think that's just kind of reaffirmed for us that talent can be anywhere. And I'm a huge believer that we don't need to make sacrifices in our life choices in order to take a job that we love. And so people can work remote. We're looking at putting some absolute offices in some unconventional areas. We're looking at the Okanagan. We're marketing jobs out there as well. We know people want to live in a lot of different places across British Columbia. We have an office in Victoria. People can work there. And so I'm sort of less concerned about how we engage and where we engage employees, and more about, I should say, where we engage with employees and more in how we engage with employees. Right? Let's meet them where they're at and figure out a way to sort of create great things together.
That is something that I think is not necessarily as well known as it could be about BC's tech sector. I was asked a question earlier in the week about, how can we persuade tech employers to be open-minded about hiring people other than in the Lower Mainland? It's like, they'll
There's tech people everywhere. And I mean, look, I grew up in BC, but I grew up in the Okanagan. It's where I'm sitting right now. And so I go into Vancouver, and I'm in Austin. I mean, we have offices everywhere. But increasingly, I'm meeting people out here who are remote working for companies all over the world. And so your talent is everywhere, and so people will come when there's a reason for them to come to an office. Collaboration, in my mind, offices moved to collaboration spaces and less kind of, anchored places where people need to be every day. And I think it changes how employees engage with you. I think they really value the time they have in a room with one another to be able to work on problems together. And it doesn't necessarily have to be every moment of every day. Some people work better at their kitchen table.
Yeah, I must admit, I'm really looking forward to getting back to some events for BC Tech, but they will be networking, they will be pitch nights, they will be job fairs. They will not be replacing, this is a very effective mechanism to do a one-on-one conversation with you and broadcast it to our members. So we don't need to return to that being in person. But it will be really nice to see real humans. Marcel, I'm counting on you to bring the wine, so you know where it is. David Bibby.
Apparently there's some near Christy's office. I'll grab it on the way back.
Exactly. So David Bibby's asking, what's your view on raising capital in Canada to scale your business, private, VC, public?
And I'm not sure if I understand the question. I mean, do I think that people should take in capital to expand their business? Yes, I do. But I also think that folks, you want to be very aware of where you're taking money from, and meaning that, my experience has been you want to be surrounded by great people who support your vision and who are really signed up for what you want to do. And so, there's all sorts of reasons why one form of raising money is more attractive than another. The cost of money, debt versus taking equity. I mean, the cost of the capital is a big function. But I do think who you're working with is a big function. And so I would encourage folks to not feel limited. Raising money in Canada, absolutely, you should do it. But there is also a lot of openness from US investors to put money into Canadian companies. Like one of Laurie's biggest investors was actually one of my former VCs in one of my previous companies as well. And so there are VCs who are very familiar with the Canadian tech space and actually really look at it as an innovative way to kind of reach more broadly and find new opportunities that maybe they didn't see before. So when the time is right and when the terms are right, yes, absolutely. Don't take too much too soon, and make sure you're thoughtful, because the world changes, as we've seen over the last couple of years. Right, the world can change on a moment's notice.
And I definitely echo both of your points. There's a lot of US money available and open-minded and interested in investing in Canadian tech companies. It can be challenging to raise capital from Canadian investors. But what matters most is what you were saying, Christy, which is, have you got the right partner that has a shared alignment on what they're looking to invest in and your business plan?
This is true in public markets as well as in private capital, right? I think even as a public company CEO right now, and we're listed on TSX and NASDAQ, I think that you're going to find some shareholders are really focused on value and how much cash can you generate, and other shareholders are focused on growth, and it's okay, but you just need to make sure that you're very clear on what your vision is and where you're going, and that you have alignment with folks who want to come on that journey with you. Because there's nothing more frustrating to an entrepreneur or to a leader who is trying to go in a direction and you're finding out later that, oops, we forgot. You thought the finish line would look like this, and we're kind of going in this direction.
There was an interesting question in the chat from Erica. So were there mentors along your personal journey that had a big impact on you?
I had, this is an area where I was really, really blessed. First of all, I am a learner that learns by doing. So I learn by working with people. I'm an avid reader, and I learn a whole bunch of different ways, but I would say the most impactful moments in my life have been when I've been working with really, really amazingly bright people, and we've had to solve really, really hard problems. And so I've just been very, very blessed, right? I did get an opportunity to work with Steve Jobs. I did. The CEO he used to be the president of Sun Microsystems and became the CEO of Motorola, was a mentor of mine and spent a lot of time with me. I think the next CEO of Motorola was a mentor of mine and spent a lot of time with me. And then I would call, some of the people who really influenced me, and I would put under that banner of mentors are in some cases they were peers. There's one woman, she was my boss early in my career. I was her boss later in our career. I think it's something I've always looked at when I've been making career decisions, which is who's there that I'm going to learn from, and what is it that I think I'm going to learn from. When I went to Apple, I had been running OS licensing for Palm Source at that time. And so title wise, like going to Apple was actually a bit of a step backwards. And at that time, by the way, Apple was, when I first got there, we had just barely launched the iPod, and everybody thought they were on the brink of death. But folks thought this was career suicide, that I was going to go to Apple. But there was just a certain amount of genius in terms of how they thought about products and how they executed product messaging and sort of, the entire leadership model there. And for me, it was worth it to kind of make that trade-off, to immerse myself in that for a period of time, because I thought there was so much there to learn. So mentors come in all shapes and forms. And I think what it is that you are trying to learn and who do you think you can learn it from needs to be a conscious decision, right? And so I've never had a mentor that I look to for everything. There's a specific thing that I'm trying to figure out, and who's really good at it, and how do I get close to them?
Great advice. I'm still stuck on say one of 5 things. Taking that away. A really interesting question from Miriam in the chat. So what do you think about using share ownership as an incentive to attract great talent? I'm sure you've seen lots of models, and you'll have one yourself, but absolutely. I'm a
huge fan of it, but I also think that when you're talking about compensation and rewards, it's important that you're using the right tool at the right time. It's difficult for companies, and the share pool is something you have to manage really carefully. Not a lot of, especially as you get larger, you start to outgrow it. And so you want to make sure you made really smart decisions kind of early on. But I think getting really dialed in to what your employees value at that particular moment. I see lots of companies give away options, especially in sort of startups or private companies. They give away options to people who don't necessarily value it, without asking the question, what's actually going to be valuable to you? And so you can take on a lot of dilution for no reason. And actually the employees saying, I really would have rather had a bonus. I have kids. And so that would have been more helpful for me right now than options that could have turned into something later in life. And so I think understanding what your employees want is an important piece. And the other piece is understanding what is in your future. There are definitely moments as an entrepreneur where you are more worried about cash versus equity and vice versa. And so striking that right balance in a consistent way, right? What you want to avoid is sort of massive changing of the rules at any sort of big moment in time. So I'm a big fan of it in the right forum and in the right environment.
Yeah. And I think that's so wise, because and taking the time to educate people about different forms and what they are, and listen to them when they say they'd rather have cash. I think that's so smart. There's definitely not as much understanding of options and how they work and where the value might come in British Columbia than you might see in, for instance, the Silicon Valley. So
the structure was a little different. It was one of the learning areas for me as I came in, how programs were set up and how they were. I think they're sort of conforming over time, but that was some of my early experience. And I trip over things and go, wait, what is that? Oh, I get it. Okay, that's a new one. But I just think, ultimately it's about the whole employee, and what you're trying to focus on is how do you keep them inspired and connected, and they may need something different from you at that moment in time.
Totally. So Raphael's asking, where do you look for inspiration? So he's asking specifically about a business book or a podcast, but what sort of informs your thinking about business?
I'm a ridiculous reader. So because I used to fly so much, it was a book of flight was kind of the normal pattern. And when books became electronic, that lightened my backpack quite a bit. Otherwise, a lot of flight attendants got books that were just sort of tucked into the back of the seat because I didn't want to carry the weight around anymore. So I would say on the book side, I'm a big biography reader. And so it's a little bit, and it's not just business books, right? I look at everything. One moment in time, I read through all the presidents of the U.S., not and sequentially though. So I'd find a biography on one, and then I'd go on to the next one. And because they would overlap, it was always so interesting because you could read kind of the same event in history, but from two opposing views in some cases. So biographies are a big place of where I go. But I will tell you that when I'm looking for inspiration within the business, it's usually going to come from people. So I will usually spend time with customers, or I will spend time with employees. If I'm trying to figure out what's next or what's going wrong or it usually involves what I call a listening tour. So spending time with customers, not necessarily talking about their deal or their license, but talking about their problems. What are the big things that are kind of keeping them up at night? It may not have anything to do with us, but when you start to hear a sequence of things that kind of all sound similar, you can string them together and go, oh, I get it. Okay, now I understand. And I would say the similar inside the organization, right? If something comes up that you don't understand, or you read something and you have a question mark, you go, okay, I'm going to just start dialing for dollars. No, nobody loves to see my name show up on their Slack channel. They're uh-oh, she's going to start grilling me.
Excellent. Okay, so let me take this one final question from the chat, and then I want to ask you another question myself. So in the journey to scale a business, which stage or sprint do you think is the hardest based on your experience?
They all feel like they're the hardest when you're in them. There's a lot written about, getting to your first viable, minimum viable product and getting your first customer feels like mission impossible until you do it. And then, trying to get to 10 million in ARR revenue is another big milestone. And it feels impossible when you're like slugging along between 2 and 3 and you just can't get there until you do it. 60 million is a big one. 100 million is like each one of them. Do you go public or stay private? Do you, for us, it was, do we dual list? Do we buy the company? Do we not buy the company? Each one of them is the hardest when you're in it. And so, I think that's why it's so healthy to kind of acknowledge that this is in chapters. You can get super frustrated if you think, like, a year ago, I was feeling great and I felt like we had this all buttoned down, and now here I am and everything feels incredibly painful. Well, you're in a different sprint, right? It's time to recalibrate. And do we have the right voices? Do we have the right tools? Are we clear on what the finish line looks like? Do we know the steps to get there? Like, you have to kind of go back to the starting line. And it can feel a little exhausting. I kind of use the playroom analogy. You come back in, you're like, I just cleaned this place up. Why are there toys everywhere all over again? How did that happen? It's going to happen.
You're making me feel better about cleaning up the playroom every day. So here's the question I really wanted to ask you about. So tell us a bit more about Absolute. So you're this big, successful anchor company in Canada. What next? What's your ambitions? Where's your growth focus right now? Tell us more about what your ambitions are.
Sure. Absolute is a really unique company. And I will tell you that, I joined the company 3.5 years ago, and I'd say 4.5 years ago, I had no idea who they were. So it's not, nobody should be embarrassed if they don't know. I still talk to customers. And I was talking to someone from the US government yesterday. They were like, how did I not know? And so the company started a very long time ago. The original use case, or one of the original use cases, was that you had children getting laptops for school for the very first time. At that time, say 20 years ago, 15 years ago, these were $5,000-$7,000 devices, and there was a pretty healthy business of stealing that laptop and reinstalling the operating system and selling it. And so you needed a security platform that could survive any event. Absolute created a platform that's actually embedded in the hardware of almost every computer you've probably owned for the last 15 years. So when we say we're embedded in 500 million devices, that's the 500 million devices we think are still alive today. It's probably well north of that in terms of what we've been embedded in. So because we're in the hardware, that gives us some unique capabilities. We can heal things independent of what's going on with the rest of the system. So if your device got compromised by ransomware, we can still connect to that device and figure out whether there's something we can do to fix it. We can geofence devices, geolocate them, find them, make sure that they work in the building, but they freeze or lock when they leave the building. So these are just a few of the things that we can do. When I first came to the company 3.5 years ago, we were just traded on TSX. We were sub 100 million, I think. We were something like 80 million. I think when I got there, growing sort of low single digits and not incredibly profitable. Today, we've been a Rule of 40 company for 6 quarters now. If anyone is in the SaaS business, go Google the Rule of 40. It's an important thing for you to know. We're tracking, mid-teens in growth and sort of mid-20s in adjusted EBITDA profitability. We're probably at about getting close to 200 million in revenue now. And part of that, we did the US listing, and we also acquired a large zero trust company. Where you're going to see us kind of go from here is, look, with everything that's happened in the world, everybody is going to be working probably not in an office. If you look at the data, more than 70% of employees say they're going to be remote or hybrid in some way. And 97% of organizations say they're going to support remote and hybrid. So this is a thing. It changes a lot about how we think about security and how we protect devices. And so that's shifting the entire world to move to endpoint security on the device, on the computer itself. And we are in a very unique position to be able to change how they think about that. So that's what we're going to go do. And we're very excited about it.
Well, I am very excited about it, to think that Easy Company is going to be right at the forefront of these, as you say, it's a totally changed world, and all bets are off. So it sounds like an exciting journey. Now, listen, one final question for you that I always ask. Do you have any words of advice for the entrepreneurs in the audience, or people who are starting out and hoping to achieve great things? But what words of advice and encouragement would you offer?
I guess I would say 2. One is, acknowledge that you are a student. And I don't care whether you're running $1 billion business or whether you're still sort of going after your first dollar. We're all learning. And it doesn't matter how many times you've done this and how many times, what parts of it are the same and what parts of it are different. We are all sort of just figuring it out as we go along. None of us have been through a pandemic before. None of us have seen what we're looking at right now. None of us have, if this is your first company, your first product, or maybe it's your 15th, there are still certainly things that you're learning. And so, I go into each and every day trying to figure out, how do I do better? What do I need to learn? What am I not seeing? And I think that keeps you awake. It keeps you agile, and it keeps you focused. And the second thing I would say is, and this was advice that was passed on from one of my mentors that we talked about earlier, which is never run from something, always run to it. So it's if you're jumping into a new opportunity or a new business, creating a new product, it's about the problem you're going to solve, or the opportunity you're running into, not the thing you're trying to move away from. And you can apply that to everything. You can apply that to your products. You can apply that to your markets. You can apply that to your hiring, your people, pretty much everything. So that would be it.
Wonderful words of advice. I'm personally going to apply it to my personal life. Thank you so much. This has really been a fantastic conversation. Our next guest will be Greg Smith, the co-founder and CEO of Thinkific, who will join us on the 7th of April. So please be sure to sign up for that session.